My name is Dan Dorval, and I'm President and CEO of Dorval and Cherney Financial Advisors. I am an independent certified financial planner and author of my book, Financial Success for the Rest of Us, Reality-Based Financial Planning for Mainstream America.
Hi, my name is Leah Woodley. I'm an associate financial advisor with Dorval and Cherney Financial Advisors. Our conversations discuss what it means to do quality of life planning in all areas of your life.
Dan, you wrote a section in your book, Financial Success for the Rest of Us, on education planning, and you addressed how you and your wife approach education planning for your children and made some recommendations to those who would be reading the book. If someone is watching this and they've never written down an education goal, what's the first question they should ask themselves?
I think there are two different ways to approach education planning. And I think that first question is, how do you want, like what path do you want to take? So the first part of the question is just simply, is this a priority for you? There are many people who say, hey, I put myself through school. My parents didn't help me. Maybe I got some scholarships or maybe I just took loans, but I made it through. So I just don't think, even if I have the means to do it, I don't think it's important for me to provide for my kids' education. And then we have other people who come in and they are the exact opposite. They're like, I will sacrifice my own personal, my retirement might get pushed back or other goals that I have in order to maybe fully fund my kids' education. And then, of course, there's everything in between. So, being on the same page about what do we actually feel good about in helping our kids, because neither one of those is right or wrong. I mean, if you have them take care of it themselves, they might really struggle, but at the same time it might make them appreciate school more. It might teach them greater responsibility. They might have to pay back loans, so there might be more of a discipline type of approach. And then on the other hand, if you provide for them, you might feel very good about that. They might be very appreciative or not. And they also might say, hey, it was great that I didn't have to struggle and I could just focus on school instead of maybe working really hard or whatever it is. So understanding what your goal is the first step and how you want to approach this. Then the second thing is, okay, what are my available resources? And the two approaches there are, number one, it might just be, okay, I would love to fund all of their education, but I only have an extra $100 a month or $200 a month that I can commit to this particular goal while staying in balance with other goals. Okay, in that scenario, you're going to save what you can. And then when you get to the point of helping them with school, that's going to dictate how you help them. And then the other side is, okay, I have so many resources. I'm available to maybe fully fund that goal. Now I'm coming at it from, okay, what does the goal cost? So maybe I want to do 2 years worth of a public education over the course of, full cost for 2 years, or maybe 50% of the cost over 4 years. And we can estimate that cost for a typical financial institution. And now we can determine how much you need to save in order to get there. So none of these different approaches is right or wrong, but you want to have a goal in place and then you want to have a strategy how to accomplish that goal.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that you and Tracy debated on private school versus public school leading up to college. Would you apply that same approach in making that decision for those
Yeah,
who are concerned about elementary and middle and high school?
obviously for like the typical relationship, you have kids, your kids are little, and then you go, well, okay, I want to save for school, but I don't know, are they going to go to school? Where are they going to go to school? What do we want to do? All those types of things. And it's very rare for a parent who has young kids to know exactly how things are going to turn out. So that makes this goal a complicated goal. So for us, we wanted a source of funding that was available just in case we decided to send our kids to private school while in like middle school or high school, as compared to like just this debate about public college versus private college. So
Mhm.
somebody might be out there viewing this video saying, hey, maybe the public schools in my district just aren't that great. And I feel it's really important to commit the resources to pay for private, high school, middle school, whatever it happens to be. Now, our kids ended up going to a charter school that was a college preparatory charter school, but we didn't have to pay the costs associated with a private school. It was essentially like a private school experience,
Mhm.
but without all the costs. So that helped us a lot in our ability to then save and accumulate for college. And then the way we viewed college is we said, okay, we're going to set aside enough to theoretically cover the cost of a public university. If they decide to go to a private university, well, maybe they'll get scholarships or something else. A lot of times, private school has a retail cost that is dramatically higher than public, but by the time you get your financial aid package, it might be the same or very similar types of costs. So we said, okay, we're going to have enough to fund public school. If it costs twice as much as that, that's their responsibility.
Yeah. Your college projections were actually remarkably accurate from 20 years ago. How should parents today estimate future college costs?
Well, there's planning software all over the place now where you can get average costs associated with pretty much any college or university in the country. We have planning software where if you tell us you want to go to, Akron and you want to know what that costs, we can just pull that up and say, hey, the average cost right now for tuition, room and board, books, we can add that up and say, now we have to apply an inflation factor. And historically speaking, the inflation factor has been higher for college education than other inflation. And yet at the same time, that's an unsustainable model. So I don't know what it's going to look like for inflation over the next 15, 20 years, but we usually assume something higher than standard inflation. So for us, we were using a 6% inflation rate. And from the original projections when our kids were little, up until when they went to school, we were literally within a couple $1,000s per year of estimated costs for our kids' college.
That's amazing. At what point does fully funding college start to interfere with retirement planning?
Yeah, I once met with a couple where they had kids a little bit later in life. They were getting a little bit closer to retirement, as their kids were approaching college age. They hadn't been able to save that much for college, but yet when we talked to them, they said, hey, we will work as long as we have to work in order to provide for our kids. Well, providing for their kids came mostly from their cash flow. So they
Mhm.
completely stopped saving for retirement outside of what their match was. They stopped saving into any sort of emergency reserve. They stopped saving for other goals. And they used every bit of cash flow that they could to help their kids with school. And even then took on loans where they were the ones that planned to pay it back as compared to the kids. And when I showed them, I said, hey, you're working until at least 70 because of this, maybe longer. They said, we're comfortable with that. Now, from a financial
Mhm.
planning perspective, that's not when they wanted to retire. But
Mhm.
when we made them aware of the sacrifice they would have to make, now they get to express their own values, their own priorities, their motivations. And they say, we're willing to accept that sacrifice in exchange for how we feel about funding education. Now, that is more of an extreme example. Most people aren't willing to do that. So somebody else might come in and say, in fact, I have a meeting today where we're going to talk about this, where they're going to say, how much can we save or how much can we use for our kids' education without sacrificing our retirement? And that is a
Mhm.
much more complicated question. Now, when we run through that, you have to make assumptions and you're not going to be accurate. So all you can do is the best job you can in trying to balance out the resources and say, okay, you still want to retire by this age, you still want this quality of life, but you also have this goal that's more immediate. That's happening now.
Mhm.
And so we know what this goal looks like. Here's where that, like if you do $50,000 per child, for three kids, here's the impact that will have. If you did $100,000 per child for three kids, now you're probably talking about moving back retirement, and they might say, no, we're not willing to do that, or yes, we're willing to accept that sacrifice.
Yeah, so ultimately it boils down to their own personal values and their own quality of life desires. What's your perspective on student loans as part of the plan? When do you feel like they're reasonable?
Yeah, in today's world, reasonable is a widely varying number. We have seen
Yeah.
people with many hundreds of thousands in student loans, and then we've seen people that through their hard work, through scholarships, their family helping, maybe they emphasize lower cost education. They might graduate college with little to no student loans. And so we're seeing wide variations because some kids have been taught, hey, as long as it's for school, it's productive debt. Just take on as much as you possibly need to do. And I think that's a real disservice to a lot of these kids because, we help a lot of nurses. And if they're coming out of college with $200,000 in student loans, unless they can qualify for the public student loan forgiveness program and just make payments for 10 years and get it forgiven, they're in a really deep hole at that point. So they end up putting off a lot of their most important life goals, those early goals. Buying a house gets much more difficult. If you get married, you have children, you just don't have a lot of available resources because that student loan is the functional equivalent of a mortgage. And now your
Mhm.
resources get spread very thin for a long time. It's not easy to pay that off. It's not like a 2 or 3 year sacrifice. It's for decades potentially in that scenario. So we always want parents to have a very detailed discussion with their kids about expectations. Can you get this degree? I know you want to go to this school. Maybe that's your favorite school, but this school is going to cost you 60, $70,000 a year. This school over here, maybe you go to a junior college or something for a couple of years, get some credits, and now you could go to your dream school and cut that whole education cost by tens of thousands of dollars or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think people need to make smarter decisions about those values and what that means rather than just saying we'll pay any cost and we'll just take the loans to cover it.
Yeah, yes, I agree. Conversations definitely need to be had up front. Now, when you all approach saving for education, you did so in a strategic way to allow some flexibility. Why don't you tell us about, your utilization of 529s and Roths and how you structured that and why you structured it that way?
Our advice is always based on what is the money for? And that's true of all goals. But with education goals, if somebody comes in, they says, okay, or they say, we really want to prioritize college funding. We want to have a bucket of money available for that. A 529 is one of the very best ways you can do that on a tax preference basis. So you start to save and accumulate in a 529. However, that is for education. So if somebody comes in, they say, we want to be able to fund education, but at the same time, we want them to have money available for a wedding, to buy a car, maybe eventually to help them buy a house or at least get started. If it's for another goal, now the 529 is not your best resource. And
Hmm.
so it's really what is the money for that drives the recommendation. Now, for most people, historically speaking, I would say even if your goal was to fully fund college for, 4 years or something like that, I would rarely tell them to fund a 529 to that level.
Hmm.
Because if life changes and goals change and you decide not to do education for that, now you're stuck in this account where, yes, you don't lose the money, but now if I take the money out for something other than education, those gains are going to be taxed and penalized rather than being tax free for education goals. Now, the government did fix some of that. You can take some of the excess and put it into a Roth IRA for the benefit of your child as well. So that gives you a little bit more flexibility. But in general, we use 529s to save for a portion of the goal. And then
Hmm.
we'll typically save in some other way that creates greater amounts of flexibility. And then when your kid goes to college, use the 529 first because that's what it's for. Use the more flexible money next because if you decide not to use it for some reason, now it can be available for other goals. So there's the best approach is usually to save in multiple ways rather than just saving into a 529 and putting everything there.
You just helped a lot of people there because a lot of people have that question on how they should approach saving. What's one misconception about education funding that you wish more people understood?
Well, I think that misconception goes back to selecting a college.
Hmm.
It's one of these things where, hey, if it's more expensive, it's better. I don't think that's true at all. And evaluating their financial aid package. Like I said earlier, you could go to a school that their retail cost on their website might be 70, $80,000, and your local public university might be 25 or $30,000. But once you go through the whole financial aid package, depending on your situation, that more expensive school might be the same cost. And so you really can't just take these generic pieces of advice. You have to look at what is my major? What am I trying to accomplish? What are my career goals? Which at 18 years old, you usually don't really know your career goals. You might have a dream about something, but my college was for engineering and now I'm a financial advisor. Your college was for engineering and now you're a financial advisor. So when you're 18 years old, you're making these very impactful life decisions, and yet you don't have life experience to know truly what you want to do in the future. So I think that misconception is that life isn't going to change. And so we can plan specifically for exactly what's going to happen. I would say education is one of the most variable goals you will ever see.
I completely agree. Is there any last things you want to leave with us for today?
I think this is another one of those, it's never a right or wrong. It is
Hmm.
personal to you. If you have friends or family that really say, hey, we're putting a lot of money towards college, you don't have to feel like you have to do that. That is not right or wrong. I have seen people where their kids took on loans and those kids learned a lot of responsibility and a lot of discipline in paying those loans back. Conversely, I've seen people pay for school and maybe the kids didn't value the education. So maybe they screwed around and partied or did whatever and either took longer or maybe they changed their major 3 or 4 different times and it became enormously expensive without adding any value to anyone's life.
Well, thank you so much for all that you've shared. And until next time, have a good one.
Thanks, Leah.
Thank you.